Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here today for this member lecture. My name is Ann Morse. I'm the an adjunct lecturer in interpretation here at the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm thrilled that we're going to have a lecture today to learn more about Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks. As we begin, a brief reminder, if you haven't done so already, please silence your mobile devices. I'm thrilled to welcome you to our member lecture with Annelise K. Madsen, the Gilda and Henry Buchbinder Associate Curator, Arts of the Americas, who co-curated Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks. This exhibition is the first to seriously examine O'Keeffe's paintings, drawings, and pastels of urban landscapes from her time in New York City. Madsen joined the Art Institute of Chicago in 2011 and specializes in U.S. painting, sculpture, and visual culture. She's particularly interested in elevating historical women artists, studying artworks in the permanent collection, stewarding acquisitions, developing exhibitions and programming, and presenting new research in an effort to recover and revalue the contributions and stories of female art makers. She is co-curator of Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks. She is also preparing an exhibition on Mary Cassatt. Madsen curated and authored John Singer Sargent and Chicago's Gilded Age from 2018 and has co-curated and contributed to a number of other exhibitions and publications at the Art Institute, including America After the Fall, Painting in the 1930s, which opened in 2016, and Art and Appetite, American Painting, Culture, and Cuisine from 2013 to 14. Madsen holds a PhD in art history from Stanford University and a BA from Washington University in St. Louis. Please join me in welcoming Annelise K. Madsen to the stage.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Art Institute. It is so wonderful to see so many of you in the audience as we open this exciting exhibition. I'm Annelise Madsen, a co-curator of Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, along with my colleague, Sarah Kelly-Oler. Sarah and I have been working on this exhibition for several years, and it is such a joy to finally be at this moment when our own efforts and those of so many great colleagues across the museum coalesce into this singular presentation of O'Keeffe and New York City. The Art Institute has not mounted a solo exhibition on O'Keeffe since 1988, 2 years after her death, and so it is indeed time to celebrate O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe enjoyed a long career. She lived to be 98 years old, building all the while an impressive legacy as an American modernist. Perhaps certain images come to mind when you think of the artist, such as enlarged, abstracted flowers or other organic forms. She began such works in the 1920s and continued to explore the subjects throughout her career. Or perhaps when you think of O'Keeffe, you think of the Southwest, views of mountains or deserts or arrangements featuring bones or crosses. Here I show you Black Cross, New Mexico in the Art Institute's collection, painted in 1929 during a first visit to the area by O'Keeffe. And this is the first O'Keeffe to enter the Art Institute's collection in 1943. Concerning both subject matter and persona, O'Keeffe is closely associated with the Southwest in the late decades of her life. Or perhaps because of our setting here in Chicago, do you think first of the dramatically scaled Sky Above Clouds 4? This painting is grandly positioned atop the staircase situated between the post-impressionist galleries and the modern wing. O'Keeffe painted this work in 1965 when she was 77 years old, inspired by the aerial views she experienced as an airplane passenger at mid-century. Sky Above Clouds was first shown at the Art Institute in 1971 and has been a fixture here ever since. But does New York come to mind when you think of the artist? O'Keeffe was a New Yorker for decades. She lived in the city on multiple occasions, covering much of her career. As a longtime city dweller, she took up the challenge of painting Manhattan, creating innovative works, including this one, the Shelton with Sunspots, New York, one of the artist's great canvases, part of the permanent collection here at the Art Institute, and truly the inspiration for this exhibition. Beginning in 1924, O'Keeffe and her husband, Alfred Stieglitz, lived in the Shelton Hotel, a novel residential skyscraper located on Lexington Avenue between 48th and 49th Streets. The experience of living high above the city motivated O'Keeffe tremendously, and she pushed her art in new directions. While celebrated for her images of flowers and southwestern landscapes, O'Keeffe's city subjects as a body of work have received relatively little attention. This exhibition is the first to seriously examine the artist's paintings, drawings, and pastels of the built environment, while also situating them in the diverse context of her other compositions of the 1920s and early 1930s. These years represent a pivotal moment of experimentation as she developed her modernist vision and seized her place in the art world. She intensively explored New York as subject matter, resulting in powerful personal works that capture both the geometries and sensations of a changing urban setting. Yet this aesthetic attention to the city around her was never O'Keeffe's singular focus. Her pursuits in the 1920s were ambitious and wide-ranging, from compositions inspired by Manhattan to formal abstractions, such as the work on the right, untethered to place, still lives, landscapes, and natural abstractions created at Lake George in upstate New York, and works featuring bones, crosses, and adobe structures and arid landscapes of the Southwest, where from 1929 onward, O'Keeffe painted each summer. And so here in the exhibition, we gather together for the first time a major constellation of O'Keeffe's city pictures, works that she called My New Yorks, and equally important, present them in relation to the great variety of aesthetic exploration that characterized her mode of making during this crucial decade. In a letter to an art critic in 1925, O'Keeffe declared, quote, "My New Yorks would turn the world over," unquote. She had big expectations for her New York canvases, and this exhibition aims to grant them their due attention as bold visual statements, as well as contextualize them within this breakout moment in O'Keeffe's career. O'Keeffe's life was truly one of perpetual movement. Born in 1887 in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, O'Keeffe expressed an interest in and a talent for art during her early years. At 15, she followed her family to Williamsburg, Virginia, where she continued to excel at art classes in school. In 1905, she returned to the Midwest, this time to Chicago, attending the School of the Art Institute for one academic year and living with an aunt and uncle in the city. Over the next decade, O'Keeffe continued her artistic formation and threw herself into new experiences, particularly as an art teacher, traveling the country in the process. After studying at the Art Students League in New York, she came back to Chicago for a couple years to work as a commercial illustrator, which she did not enjoy, and then took on a series of teaching engagements and coursework based at times in Virginia, New York, South Carolina, and Texas. The ground shifted for O'Keeffe in 1916, when the influential gallerist and photographer Alfred Stieglitz learned of her work and first exhibited some of her drawings in New York. The event marked a whirl of correspondence between them and what would become an enduring relationship. And this is a photograph of the couple taken many years later. In 1918, Stieglitz convinced O'Keeffe to leave her teaching post in Texas and move to New York City to focus on her art making. The two soon lived together, Stieglitz leaving his wife and family in the process, and they married in 1924. And for the better part of 3 decades, they were an art world power couple, advancing their own careers while also playing important roles in each other's professional lives, and doing so all the while navigating the dynamics of their personal relationship. 1918 thus marks a moment of reorientation in O'Keeffe's career when New York City becomes an important locus of activity. After the vast distances she had trekked from South Carolina to the Midwest to West Texas, O'Keeffe settled into a new rhythm with Stieglitz. From late fall until spring, they lived in Manhattan. Then summer and early autumn were spent in upstate New York at Lake George with Stieglitz's extended family. O'Keeffe took occasional trips to paint elsewhere, but this back and forth between urban and rural New York would persist until 1929, when O'Keeffe added New Mexico to her seasonal itinerary. It's important to keep in mind that the artist's shift to New York was not without prologue. She had spent several short periods of time here, time in the city over the previous decade. And another big city, our own second city, was quite familiar. O'Keeffe forged numerous connections to Chicago throughout her career, beginning with her student days at the School of the Art Institute. Spending time in Chicago in the early years of the 20th century, O'Keeffe witnessed yet another vibrant vertical city. Skyscrapers were rising here at an incredible pace, and one would imagine that the dynamic built environment would have made an impression on the artist. As this exhibition lays out, it was in New York that O'Keeffe eventually made the city her subject. In 1926, O'Keeffe stated, quote, "One can't paint New York as it is, but rather as it is felt," unquote. Her approach to the material around her was not one of transcription, but one of translation. The artist was not intent on documenting what she saw detail by detail. Instead, she aimed to translate her own lived experiences and sensations into paint. She did so from her apartment, high up in the Shelton, gazing down at the city below, and conversely, from street level, directing her eyes back upward. And here is one such street level view of the Radiator Building, and we'll return to it. Her desire to paint New York in the 1920s, as O'Keeffe characterized it decades later, was met with resistance. She wrote, quote, "I had never lived up so high before and was so excited that I began talking about trying to paint New York. Of course, I was told it was an impossible idea. Even the men hadn't done too well with it," unquote. O'Keeffe faced the challenge head-on, navigating all the while the gendered interpretations steadfastly imposed on her art by critics, the press, and the public alike. From early on in her career, O'Keeffe's paintings and drawings captivated audiences, garnering press attention and praise. Yet underlying much of this critical acclaim was an assumption that because she was a woman, her artworks necessarily expressed something feminine, tethered to her emotions and even her physical nature as a woman. O'Keeffe strongly disagreed. Her ambition to tackle New York as subject matter, besting the men, can be seen as one of her strategies in the 1920s to move beyond these limits. I show you here a photograph of Stieglitz taken by O'Keeffe in 1918, shortly after her move to New York, when she was on the cusp of launching her career. Stieglitz would end up taking more than 300 photographs of her, comprising a comprehensive portrait that he exhibited in 1921. The set features a variety of depictions of the artist: clothed and nude, ranging from isolated parts of her body to full-length views. In this photograph, which is in the exhibition, O'Keeffe poses in front of one of her own artworks. And so we can more readily discern O'Keeffe as maker, as an artistic force herself within the frame. Yet overall, the series complicated things for O'Keeffe. Stieglitz's intensive gaze contributed to sexualized readings of her work again and again on the part of critics. In the early 1920s, before she dug into her new material of New York, O'Keeffe honed in on compositions that landed firmly on the representational end of the aesthetic spectrum. Instead of abstractions, which she could likewise execute boldly and fluidly, O'Keeffe chose to exhibit a large selection of still lives and studies of nature, leaves, fruits, vegetables, flowers, trees, and more. In a 1924 letter, O'Keeffe made her intentions clear. Quote, "My work this year is very much on the ground. There will be only 2 abstract things, or 3 at most. All the rest is as objective as I can make it. I suppose the reason I got down to an effort to be objective is I didn't like the interpretation of my other things," unquote. By the following year, 1925, O'Keeffe had executed her first cityscape, shown here, New York Street with Moon. A monumental form rises at center, a smooth, simplified mass based on the Hotel Chatham, a 13-story structure that then stood on Vanderbilt Avenue. Other buildings lean into the space on the sides here, and they reveal this play of what O'Keeffe called sky shapes beyond. She was really interested in the spaces between the buildings and what kind of formal elements they revealed. And she's also playing with the effects of light. We have the street light, a stoplight, and the moon all at play here. It is a dramatic opening statement by O'Keeffe, and the current exhibition begins with this painting, which is hung alongside a number of other works undertaken between 1923 and 1925. In this first gallery, you will see the works that you would see adjacent to New York Street with Moon were all part of a group show held at Stieglitz's gallery in 1925 called 7 Americans. O'Keeffe continued to produce paintings along objective lines, a means to push back at the critics, as she had explained, but she also featured dazzling abstractions. And here are 2 among that great variety: From the Lake #1 at left and The Chestnut Tree, gray, at right. Now, in placing New York Street with Moon in the context of works from the 1925 exhibition, we are, in a sense, reimagining the show that O'Keeffe herself had intended. As it turned out, although ready for exhibition, her New York painting did not go on view that year. Stieglitz, most likely, was the one who said no, thus undoing O'Keeffe's plans. Decades later, she recounted what happened. She stated, quote, "The men decided they didn't want me to paint New York. They wouldn't let me hang the picture. They told me to leave New York to the men. I was furious," unquote. O'Keeffe in the end had the last word. She included New York Street with Moon in her solo exhibition the following year at Stieglitz's gallery. And as O'Keeffe stated, matter-of-factly, quote, "It sold on the very first day of the show. The very first picture sold. From then on, they let me paint New York," unquote. Her urban canvases thereafter developed in a variety of directions, and this is the most abstract among the group. O'Keeffe called it New York Night, Madison Avenue. With its intersecting lines and softly shaded planes, the painting is not initially recognizable as one of the artist's New Yorks. Yet the title opens up this association. O'Keeffe articulated a vision of the underlying geometry of city streets when viewed from above. The streak of yellow extending from the center to the upper right here suggests headlights from moving vehicles or street lamps illuminating the way. O'Keeffe moved easily between representation and abstraction. She was never simply working in one mode at a time. Instead, she explored numerous subjects and aesthetic vocabularies concurrently. The motivating force behind such curiosity and dexterity was her own lived experiences. O'Keeffe's art making remained firmly rooted in the world around her. Take, for example, these three works. Again, at left, New York Night, Madison Avenue. At center, Abstraction Blue. And at right, Dark Iris Number 1. O'Keeffe exhibited all three paintings at her 1928 exhibition at Stieglitz's gallery. Together, they demonstrate the artist's incredible command of artistic vocabularies. A New York that is abstract and coded in its references to the city. The striking Abstraction Blue is a vivid, formal exploration of the color, evoking flowers, vegetal forms, even music, yet giving no clear indication of its subject matter or physical point of departure. And Dark Iris, the most representational, presents an elongated view of the flower brought dramatically up to the front of the picture plane. O'Keeffe's deep engagement with New York as subject matter began with the Shelton Hotel. Her encounter with the skyscraper was personal, enduring, and generative. Located on Lexington Avenue between 48th and 49th Streets, the Shelton was the first of its kind in New York, allowing residential living above the 11th floor, truly a new experience. And so it must have been a revelation to the senses when she and Stieglitz moved into the building in November of 1924. The architect, Arthur Lewis Harmon, designed innovative setbacks at the 16th and 22nd floors, so these areas that recess as it goes up, which allowed more light to descend into the street canyons below, created multiple rooftop terraces, and granted panoramic views to the apartments. The Shelton offered plentiful amenities for guests, and this was really high-rise living was a new kind of city living, and it was certainly a privileged one. The Shelton had opened in late 1923 as a residential hotel for men. But the policy was revised the following October, and the Shelton's doors were opened to women. And so O'Keeffe became one of the building's earliest female residents when she moved in a month later. And here are advertisements for the new Shelton that appeared in a journal called International Studio in early 1925, calling out in particular the advantages of the space for a painter like O'Keeffe. One of the ads states, quote, "It is an ideal place for artists and artistic people to live for a day or for a year," unquote. Now, short-term or temporary living was the typical state of affairs for O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. The couple's lifestyle was marked by seasonal moves. Winters were spent in Manhattan. As summer approached, they packed up their belongings, vacated their living quarters, and headed upstate. Sometime during the fall, they moved back to the city, and then the pattern repeated. Their first stay at the Shelton in late 1924, however, did not follow this pattern. They resided there for only a month while they awaited the renovations of another apartment building, this one a 4-story brownstone on 58th Street. And so after a taste of living high above the city, they quickly found themselves back down near the bustle of street level again in December of 1924. Stieglitz and O'Keeffe felt stretched by the cost of the Shelton and didn't initially pursue it as something long-term. Yet when they headed to Lake George the following summer, they were not able to secure the 58th Street apartment for the fall. And so plans took shape for a move back to the Shelton, which would become their urban home base for the next decade. In December 1925, when the couple was settling into their first long seasonal stay, Stieglitz wrote to a friend, quote, "New York is madder than ever, the pace ever increasing. But Georgia and I don't seem to be of New York, nor of anywhere. We live high up in the Shelton. We feel as if we were out at mid-ocean. All is so quiet except the wind." O'Keeffe executed a number of exterior views of her skyscraper home, including a painting that she ranked among her best, The Shelton with Sunspots, New York. The origin of this canvas was rooted in a particular experience. O'Keeffe recalled, quote, "I went out one morning to look at the Shelton Hotel, and there was the optical illusion of a bite out of one side of the tower made by the sun, with sunspots against the building and against the sky," unquote. Here, within New York's monumental urban environment, the artist revealed nature's enduring power. We don't know how many Shelton works O'Keeffe created in total, but here are the 3 known paintings. Along with the Shelton with Sunspots, there is Shelton Hotel, New York, #1 at left, and the Shelton at night at right, which fortunately was photographed before O'Keeffe decided to destroy the work, something she did do on occasion. These 3 compositions demonstrate an ambition to transform the structure with her brush in markedly different ways. In distinction to the organic inflections of the Art Institute's painting, the work at left emphasizes the geometric plays of form inspired by the skyscraper's repeating windows and multiple setbacks. The Shelton at night appears to be a study of light, the artificial glow of the streetlight, the high-rises' illuminated windows, and the natural light of the sky and moon beyond. In addition to making the Shelton the subject of her pictures, O'Keeffe focused on elevated views experienced from the building itself, particularly views looking out her apartment windows. Over the years, she resided on various floors. In the fall of 1927, she and Stieglitz moved into their favorite apartment, number 3003 on the 30th floor, where they returned year after year. This unit was located on the eastern side of the building, affording views east, but also north and south. A journalist in 1928 noted its impressive sightlines, quote, "It seemed all windows, windows overlooking housetops, steel framework chimneys, windows to the east through which the panorama of the river and bridge came flooding," unquote. For several years, beginning in 1926, O'Keeffe worked on a series of East River pictures in oil and pastel. The compositions hone in on the eastern edge of Manhattan, activity along the water, and the industrial landscape of Queens beyond. This is the largest of them, entitled East River from the 30th Story of the Shelton Hotel, painted in 1928. Here, O'Keeffe portrayed the crisp light of springtime. As a whole, the works reveal changing seasons, sunny and overcast skies, and powerful visions of the cityscape in abstracted form. A number of other works have similar proportions, such as these 3, but then within the space of each canvas, O'Keeffe pursued distinctive visions of the city. At left, the view of the East River is atmospheric and suggestive, highlighted by the silhouetted skyline and hazy vista beyond. In the East River picture at center, O'Keeffe captured the cold, raw sensations of a winter day, employing visibly thick brushwork for the snowy rooftops here. And you have to go see it in person. And at right, a brighter daylight characterizes the scene, combined with the steam and smoke of the industrial landscape. This elevated vista was something both O'Keeffe and her husband Stieglitz lived with. It defined their daily surroundings in the Shelton. And as each artist pursued their work in the late 1920s, they explored the view from the window. And Stieglitz did so through his preferred medium, photography. He too framed the East River, notably in the work at left. This horizontal photograph captures an expansive atmospheric view of the urban setting. In the vertical print at right, by contrast, he showcased the geometric play of a more closely cropped, abstracted cityscape. This is a standout work among O'Keeffe's East River series, one of my favorites, a radiant pastel entitled Pink Dish and Green Leaves. Here, she attempted a view from her apartment window unlike any other. This is the only East River composition to visualize a portion of the artist's domestic space in the Shelton. And now we're talking about just a little, take on her world where you have a windowsill and the molding and this lovely compote at center. The work is at once a luminous still life with an expansive industrial vista beyond the glass compote and the windowsill. O'Keeffe was an experimenter, and when she honed in on the East River as subject, she was not satisfied by doing it just one way. In undertaking the subject in series, executed over several years, she spent time with the material and took her exploration towards different ends. This, for instance, is the only vertical work among O'Keeffe's East River compositions. Like the windowsill view, the painting is distinctive, here for its stylized forms and vibrant palette. From the perspective of her apartment window, O'Keeffe portrayed a radiating sun above with these flares of sunspots around it, evoking the sunspots that we've seen in our painting, the Shelton with sunspots. And together that it really evokes the intensity of this visual experience. O'Keeffe dramatically transformed the view, and she achieved quite viscerally, as she put it, New York as it is felt. There's something kind of palpable to this composition with her color palette and the way that she manipulates form. She experienced the city from up high, but she likewise did so from on the ground. Always one to take long walks, O'Keeffe exited the Shelton and moved through her neighborhood on foot. Her street-level views of Manhattan must have taken shape during these outings, including recognizable skyscrapers such as the newly built Radiator Building at left, as well as unknown structures and locales captured in compositions of heightened abstraction, such as a street at right. It is important to note that New York in these years was not uniformly developed. And so as O'Keeffe assumed the role as pedestrian, she did not encounter an uninterrupted wall of buildings block by block. Rather, her movements at street level revealed great distinctions of height among structures, as well as gaps in the sightline. There were construction projects underway, open lots, and other low-rise buildings in the mix. New vistas and unexpected relationships between forms unveiled themselves as she walked the city. In her painting of the Radiator Building, for instance, O'Keeffe captured a distance view of the structure from street level, thanks to the adjacent green space of Bryant Park. She could get far away from the building and take it all in, which gave her this unobstructed sightline. The Radiator Building's unusual black cladding and nighttime illumination would have made for a dramatic encounter on an evening walk, and O'Keeffe captured that sensation in the painting through her particular aesthetic sensibilities. As in the city, O'Keeffe took solitary walks wherever she found herself, and during these outings, she liked to find and collect handheld things to take back to her studio: leaves, flowers, shells, rocks, bones, and more. This great variety of material inspired an equally broad and impressive range of works. In the same years that she produced her New Yorks, O'Keeffe continually explored still lives, landscapes, and an array of natural abstractions. Like the East River series or East River pictures, she pursued these handheld things in series. A flower or a shell, for instance, could be the point of departure for repeated investigation. At left is the painting with a long title, Ballet Skirt or Electric Light from the White Rose motif. And this is one episode of a serial investigation of a white rose, here pared down and highly abstracted. At right is a glowing pastel, slightly opened clamshell. O'Keeffe embraced this minuscule object and celebrated it truly, communicating in the process something that feels grand and enduring. At her annual exhibitions at Stieglitz's galleries, O'Keeffe convincingly demonstrated the variety and depth of her production with a wide-ranging checklist. The artist's 1927 exhibition was exemplary of this approach. Notably, the works on display that year included a critical mass of O'Keeffe's New Yorks for the first time. Alongside East River pictures, views of the Shelton, and street-level compositions like City Night at left, she hung paintings of irises and other blooms, found objects like a shell in series, including the work at right, Shell in Old Shingle 6, trees and barns and landscapes, as well as formal abstractions. This was a turning point in O'Keeffe's career, to be sure. Her pictures began to sell for important sums, and museums made their first acquisitions. And decades later, O'Keeffe linked the period to her financial independence, stating, quote, "I've made my living selling my paintings since 1927, unquote. O'Keeffe demonstrated tremendous dexterity when it came to scale. She could transform one thing into something else, such as a white rose into a ballet skirt or an electric light. She likewise reconceived how we see objects in the world, taking flowers from minuscule to magnified. Years later, O'Keeffe connected the scaling up of flowers with the changes to her New York environment. She said of her flower pictures, quote, "I'll make them big, like the huge buildings going up. People will be startled. They'll have to look at them." And they did, unquote. Manipulations of scale likewise worked in the other direction. She contained vast landscapes and cityscapes within her easel-sized canvases. In a 1946 interview, O'Keeffe told the story of a gallery visitor who asked, "Why do you paint flowers so large?" She in turn replied, quote, "I pointed to a picture of the East River and said, 'You'd never ask me why I make the East River so small,'" unquote. So flowers and New Yorks were part and parcel of the same aesthetic project. She labored on one subject in view of the other. In 1929, after a string of gallery shows featuring New York subjects among this great variety of work, O'Keeffe set out on a new adventure, heading to New Mexico for a summer of painting. She didn't leave New York completely in the rear view. Instead, her explorations of high-rise living and walks around Midtown stayed with her as she engaged with the distinct landscapes and objects of the Southwest. And after an invigorating stay, she returned to New York at the end of the summer. And here are two examples of the work she painted that first summer in the Southwest. At left, Dead Tree, Bear Lake, Taos, and at right, Ranchos Church, number 3. The tree, with its silvery, twisted form rising through the center of the composition, relates formally to O'Keeffe's street-level views of towering skyscrapers. And in the work at right, she honed in on a sliver of a view of the 18th century Spanish colonial mission church. This was architecture of a different kind than the high-rise buildings of New York. O'Keeffe explored the monumental adobe structure with fresh eyes, abstracting its forms by flattening a detail of the church against the intense blue sky. At Stieglitz's gallery, New York Gallery, in the following year, O'Keeffe mounted an exhibition entitled 27 New Paintings, New Mexico, New York, Lake George. You can see here in this installation view that she hung one of her great skyscraper pictures, New York Night, along two southwestern works, After a Walk Back of Mabel's and Black Cross, New Mexico, bringing her varied aesthetic explorations into dialogue. And in the present exhibition, you can see these three paintings together in the galleries. An evening vista across an illuminated skyline of a bustling city, the monumental form of a boulder rising against a vivid, abstracted background, and the intense presence of a black cross pulled to the front of the picture plane with a glowing landscape beyond. O'Keeffe intended for her audiences to encounter such works within the space of a single exhibition, prompting visitors then and now to discern formal harmonies among the set and to take in the expansive range across subject and location that O'Keeffe captured so boldly with her brush. Cow's Skull with Calico Roses, painted in 1931, represents another of the artist's newfound pursuits. That year, she told a reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, quote, "Bones and flowers run together in my mind when I think of the desert," unquote. As was her habit to seek out handheld objects wherever she was, the Southwest presented something entirely different in this respect: animal bones. O'Keeffe was drawn to skulls and other skeletal fragments, collecting them on her outings during her summers there. And then she did something rather amazing. She shipped barrels and boxes of bones back east. In July 1931, O'Keeffe wrote to Stieglitz, quote, Stieglitz was then at Lake George, and she wrote to him there, quote, "Don't open my packages when they come. There is nothing in them that would interest you. I'm sending a barrel and 2 packages aside from my box. Nothing but trash, I suppose, but it is trash I seem to think I want," unquote. As the Herald Tribune later reported, this unusual cargo made its way to the Shelton Hotel when the couple returned there in the fall. O'Keeffe had brought a part of the Southwest back with her to New York, and so it's really interesting to think of Cow's Skull with Calico Roses as a New York picture. Bleached animal bones and the fabric or paper flowers that she had encountered at grave sites in New Mexico, these materials were in her Shelton apartment. With panoramic views of the East River around her, O'Keeffe may well have labored on a desert-like painting. And indeed, the Southwest's presence in New York for O'Keeffe comes through in a series of photographs taken in 1936 by Carl van Vechten. O'Keeffe and Stieglitz had recently moved to another high-rise in Midtown. This was located on 54th Street, a little closer to the East River. Now here, the artist poses on the building's rooftop terrace. At right, she is against a fence with a cropped view of the city behind her. And at left, she stands against the terrace's brick facade with one of the skulls that she had collected mounted on the wall. The artist's engagement with bones and artistic material continued to hold the attention of the press. In 1938, for instance, Life magazine published a feature on O'Keeffe, including photos of her in New Mexico, handling her carcasses and bones, as well as in New York. One at her apartment window. She's got her paintbrushes here, and she's mending one of her skulls. And you'll recognize this as one of Van Vechten's photos. So while O'Keeffe brought her lessons of painting New York to the Southwest, she also, in very tangible ways, brought the Southwest back to the city. This large-scale painting, entitled Manhattan, likewise demonstrates how O'Keeffe readily made connections across subject matter and site. She executed an expansive array of flat, geometric skyscrapers. Formally, the work feels cubist in spirit and distinct from her other city abstractions. Nothing quite looks like this. We also see those cloth or paper flowers from the Southwest, right? We got 3 different flowers here, floating atop the urban landscape. It is an unexpected element, but one that does seem in keeping with O'Keeffe's enduring interest in working concurrently in one aesthetic mode, more than one aesthetic mode. Subject matter, vocabulary, locale, and scale were variables that the artist juggled, flexed, and combined to wondrously varied effect. The mid-1920s into the early 1930s mark O'Keeffe's most intensive period of experimentation on her New Yorks. But in subsequent years, her efforts to render the city as her own did not disappear entirely. In 1949, for instance, the artist turned her attention to one of the city's iconic structures, the Brooklyn Bridge. And the composition at left is full of drama and movement, evoking the experience of walking across the bridge while looking upward. The year 1949 was a transitional one for O'Keeffe as she moved permanently from New York to New Mexico and thus ended her seasonal home base in the city. But after that, she did return periodically for visits as she maintained connections to the art world in New York. Here, in a photograph taken about 1960, she captured a view out of the window where she was staying, and you see the gauzy curtain at left from her window and a view of the Chrysler Building rising amid the skyline beyond. O'Keeffe did pick up a camera herself later in her career, using it as a tool for thinking and working through compositional questions. The current exhibition, Georgia O'Keeffe, My New Yorks, gives due attention to the artist's fascinating visions of Manhattan. These bold and varied compositions capture the city, as O'Keeffe herself put it, as it is felt. Equally important, the exhibition presents her New Yorks in context, amid the great variety of aesthetic experimentation that O'Keeffe relentlessly pursued in these years. And to conclude, I offer the words of critic Frances O'Brien, who interviewed the artist in her Shelton apartment in 1927. And she penned this lyrical description of O'Keeffe's work. She wrote, quote, "Paintings of flowers and leaves, and the music of flowers and leaves. Paintings also of tall buildings, of tiny shells, of Lexington Avenue," unquote. So thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy these first few moments of the exhibition and discover a new window onto O'Keeffe and her amazing body of work. Thank you.